Grace Man Knowledge of GMK. Welcome to my YouTube channel, where you are taught all you need to know about accounting, finance, and lots more. Remember to like, share, and subscribe.
In this episode, we're looking at Proforma Invoice, and receipt with detailed exposition. Oftentimes, people interchange Proforma Invoice and receipt. But in this episode, we'll make effort to give the differences between these three concepts. We have Proforma Invoice, we have invoice, and we have receipt. This is the chain of events. Proforma Invoice preludes invoice, while invoice preludes receipts. What is Proforma Invoice? Proforma Invoice could also be referred to as quote or estimate. Proforma Invoice is a document that is requested by the buyer, or that is given by the seller to the buyer, showing the estimate or quotes of goods to be, of quote of quantity and price of goods to be sold or services to be rendered. So it's what Proforma Invoice helps to do. It helps the buyer to decide on what quantity of goods to buy or at what particular price. It was mentioned earlier that it is a quote or an estimate. So be as it may, Proforma Invoice is a quote or estimate that helps the buyer to decide on what quantity to buy or the price to pay for a particular good or service. We go to invoice. Invoice is referred to a document that shows what is due by a buyer to the seller for goods that have been sold or goods that have been delivered or service that has been rendered. Now we go to receipt. What is receipt? Receipt is a document, a layman's term. Receipt is a document that acknowledges payment. Here we say that receipt is a document that shows the payment made by the buyer to the seller for goods sold or service rendered. It is a document that acknowledges payment received. This simply means, now breaking it down in the order of events, Proforma Invoice comes first. Please note that it is not in all situations that Proforma Invoice comes first. There are times that the buyer will not require Proforma Invoice, meaning that at a glance they conclude on the price to pay for the goods to be sold or the service to be rendered and the quantity to buy. And once that is agreed on, it is supplied. Once it is supplied, invoice is issued, and once payment is received on those goods supplied and service rendered, payment is made and receipt is issued. But there are also situations where the buyer will request from the seller Proforma Invoice, and that actually also helps the buyer to negotiate. The negotiation can be, okay, if I buy a quantity, will the price go down? And that helps the buyer to take decision. But once the goods are supplied, it simply means that this payment is now due, and that is when the supplier sends the buyer an invoice. Please note that for Proforma Invoice can be given to a buyer and nothing happens after them if the buyer is not comfortable with the terms of the purchase. But in a situation where the buyer is okay, or they are able to reach a particular compromise on what to buy or on what to sell or what to buy or the service to render, then it moves to invoice. And once invoice is issued, it simply means that the buyer has accepted the goods or the service render, and what goes after issuing an invoice is for the seller to be expecting payment from the buyer. Having given this background explanation to three concepts: Proforma invoice, and receipt, it will be important for us to also talk about the difference between Proforma Invoice and invoice, as it was earlier stated that Proforma Invoice and invoice, they are two different concepts. The first difference we have here, it is a prelude to sales. I mentioned earlier that yes, it is a prelude to sales. That simply means that before sales is made, before an invoice is issued, it does happen that buyer can decide to request for proforma invoice, and as I said earlier, the buyer request for proforma invoice so as to decide on what quantity to buy or what the price to pay for a particular good or for a particular service to be rendered. So usually it produces. That was why I said that it would also be referred to as a quote. So quote doesn't mean that sales have been what? Have been made. Estimate doesn't also mean that sales have been made. So you can give a quote to a buyer, you can give an estimate to a buyer. If the buyer is not comfortable with it, it ends there. It is not legally binding on both parties as no transaction has occurred. So it preludes sales. While invoice confirms sales. Invoice is issued at that point that the goods have been supplied to the buyer. The buyer is okay with the supply made, and what is next? What is next is for the buyer what to make payment. So while performer invoice prelude sales, invoice what confirm sales. And what does it mean to confirm sale? The buyer has accepted that he or she is indebted to the seller to this amount of money. The second difference we have here is it is issued by the seller upon request by the buyer. What does this mean? It is the buyer that requests for what performer invoice. Just as I said that it is a quote or what or an estimate for the buyer to decide. So the seller issues it to the what to the buyer to decide on what to pay, and this decision will lead to the kind of order to be placed, because decision is a function of the decision determines the quantity or the price. So once the buyer is okay with the quantity to order or and the price to pay, he tells them to take decision of the what of the order. For the invoice, it is issued by the seller to the buyer to request for payment on the goods that have been sold or service that has been what that has been rendered. You take note of something here. Here, order is to be placed. Here, order has already been placed. So it is when order has been placed, it is when order has been met. That means the supply has been made. That is when invoices are what are issued. An invoice is issued. Going to the third difference, proforma invoice, it is not legally binding. It is just an estimate. I mentioned while explaining the real concept that it is an estimate or a quote. So being an estimate or a quote, it is not legally binding. A buyer can request for quote or estimate from 5 different suppliers or sellers and not buy from any one of them, because he doesn't know that there is an agreement. Neither does he know that goods has been supplied or what or service has been rendered. Hence, it is not what legally binding. But for invoice legally binding. Why? Because they have agreed on the terms of purchase and the goods have been supplied to the buyer, and in the case of service has been rendered. So in that situation, the document is legally binding and it binds the buyer to pay whatever is due on the goods sold or service rendered from by the seller. This fourth difference, for proforma invoice, it is a quote or an estimate. That has been explained. For invoice, it is a bill. Why is it a bill? It is a bill because it is a bill that has been sent, that is due by the seller, sorry, by the buyer to the seller, having received a particular quantity of goods at a particular price, or having enjoyed a particular service at a particular price. So, proforma invoice is a quote or an estimate, while invoice is a bill because it is what it is binding on the seller, and also the buyer is obligated to make such payment. Now we go to the fifth difference. It helps buyer to decide on what quantity or price to pay for the goods or service. Having discussed the difference between proforma invoice and invoice, here we have the difference between invoice and receipts. As we mentioned at the beginning of this exposition, that proforma invoice and receipt, they are chains of events. Invoice, it is a prelude to payment. What does it mean? It is a document that the seller sends to the buyer, telling the buyer the amount that is due from the buyer for a particular good that have been sold or service that has been rendered. So it preludes payment. It is when the goods have been supplied, the buyer sees the invoice and the buyer pays. So the invoice is what the buyer needs to confirm what has been delivered before payment is made. While receipt confirms the payment. So while invoice is the document that is sent for the buyer to pay, receipt is the document that is given to the buyer after payment is made for a particular what goods or service rendered. For invoice, the GL of the buyer in the book of the seller is debited. After this difference, we have a practical scenario to purchase this. GL here is the general ledger of the buyer. So the general ledger of the buyer here in the book of the seller is debited. Why? Because the buyer is a debtor prior to the advent of IFRS, and after conversion to IFRS, the buyer is a receivable. So once an invoice is issued, the general ledger of the buyer in the book of the seller will be debited, being a debtor. When payment is made and receipt is issued, the general ledger of the buyer in the book of the seller is credited. Going to the third one, invoice contains payments due for goods sold or service rendered to the buyer, while receipt contains payment for goods sold or service rendered. This buttresses the first point made, that invoice is a prelude to payment while receipt confirms payment. This contains payment due. Payment due is the prelude to payment. So it is when the buyer has an idea, has the knowledge of the payment that is due for goods sold or service rendered, while receipt contains payment for goods sold or service rendered. So here we have the list of goods sold and service rendered, while here shows the payment for particular goods that have been sold or service rendered. To crown the difference between invoice and receipt, here we have invoice is a request for payment, meaning that it is a document that is used by the seller to request for payment from the buyer, while receipt is a proof of payment. That means that how does a buyer know that he or she has made payment for a particular goods that have been bought or particular service that have been enjoyed? It is the proof of payment. So once payment is made, receipt is issued by the seller to the buyer, stating the amount paid and for what goods or services the payment is for. Now we go into the accounting treatment of an invoice. Recall that I mentioned that for Proforma Invoice, it is as though there is no activity, because it is an estimate or a quote. Nothing has happened no transaction has happened between the seller and the buyer. But once an invoice is issued, that means a particular transaction has happened between the buyer and the seller. Hence, once an invoice is issued, there has to be an accounting treatment from both the buyer and the seller. Halfway Project Limited bought 5 units of laptop from Greystech Limited, totally 1.5 million naira, VAT exclusive of 7.5%. From this scenario, Halfway Project Limited is the buyer, while Greystech Limited is the seller. Halfway Project Limited, being the buyer, will eventually be the debtor, while Greystech Limited is the creditor. So while Halfway Project Limited is a debtor to Greystech Limited, Greystech Limited is a creditor to Halfway Project Limited. So let's show the accounting entry for this in the book of what? Halfway Project Limited. We have a description, we have a debit leg, we have a credit leg. It is an asset. It is an asset. We have our equipment, laptop. Halfway being the buyer. Recall that under IAS 16, While recognizing an asset, the cost of the asset will be capitalized, and also any applicable tax that is any applicable tax to the procurement of same asset. So in this case, the cost of the asset is 1.5 million naira, while the VAT is 112,500 naira, which is 7.5% of this. So this will give us, that means the equipment will be debited with 1,612,500 naira. Other things being equal, that would mean that the amount that is payable to Grace Tech Limited is 1,612,500. This means that this is what is due to Grace Tech Limited. Please note that customers are the agent of the government to withhold tax. The assumption here is the assumption here is that Parkway Limited is not withholding tax. To understand the concept of withholding tax and value added tax, you can make reference to the link above. Having shown the accounting entry of this transaction in the book of Parkway Project Limited, who is the debtor, let's also show the other side, that is the treatment of the accounting entry of this invoice in the book of the seller. The seller here is Grace Tech Limited. In the book of Grace Tech Limited, the seller, we have a description, we have a debit side, we have a credit side. Parkway Limited bought 5 units of laptop from Grace Tech Limited, totaling 1.5 million naira. VAT exclusive of 7.5 million. For Grace Tech Limited, the revenue is 1.5 million naira. Grace Tech Limited, as an agent of the government, to charge, collect, and remit value-added tax. The VAT payable account of Grace Tech will be credited with 112,500. The total sum of this is what is due from Parkway Project Limited, being the seller and the debtor. So the debtor's account here, Parkway Project Limited, will be debited with 1,612,500 naira. So, in the book of the seller, Grace Tech Limited, Grace Tech Limited is expecting 1,612,500 naira from Parkway Project Limited. Having discussed the accounting entry with respect to invoice, we'll be rounding up this episode with the accounting entry for receipts. Recall that when we're doing the accounting entry for the invoice, we said that Parkway Project bought 5 units of laptops from Grace Tech Limited, and then we showed the accounting entry both in the book of the buyer, Parkway Project Limited, and the book of the seller, Grace Tech Limited. In this scenario now, we are talking about the receipts accounting treatment. Parkway Project Limited paid Grace Tech 750,000 by check, being pertinent of the 5 laptops. What is the accounting treatment for this? We also said that Parkway is the buyer, while Grace Tech is the seller. Let's show this payment in the book of the buyer. We have a description. How about debit side? Parkway paid 750,000 naira knowing fully well that wasted is a creditor to Parkway. So the first thing to do, liability is decreasing. So creditor, the general ledger of wasted will be debited with 750,000 naira. We're told that Parkway project paid by check and the bank account of Parkway will also be credited with what 750,000 naira. This is the accounting treatment of this payment in the book of Parkway Project Limited. So we go on to do the accounting treatment of this payment in the book of Wasted Limited. And Wasted Limited, as mentioned there, is the seller and also a creditor to Parkway Project Limited. Wasted received 750,000 naira by check from Parkway Project Limited. Recall that when the invoice was issued to Parkway Project Limited, the general ledger of Parkway Project Limited was debited, being a debtor to Wasted Limited. Now that Parkway Project Limited, the debtor, has paid part of its indebtedness to Wasted, that means now that asset is reducing, that simply means that what the general ledger of Parkway Project Limited in the books of Wasted Limited will be credited. So we have the debtors account, that is per will be credited with 750,000 naira. Thank you so much for watching. Do not forget to like,